Stu, you want to?
Sure. Welcome back, Mark. We've been chatting for a second. So glad to have you back here and for helping us out kind of in a crisis mode. So we really appreciate that. For those of you who didn't hear the intro last time, I'll kind of repeat it or some of it. After completing his PhD at Stanford University, Mark embarked on a career in international business development. He joined COS Incorporated in Palo Alto, California in 1982, later worked for several years out of the Paris office and retired from their New York office as a senior vice president in 2018. COS is a private firm that provides business and economic development services. Mark has worked on engagements with some of the largest United States and European and Asian companies and governmental agencies, including the French Ministry of Commerce, City of New York Economic Development Corporation, and the mayors of Metz and Marseille. This time, Mark is going to tell us about Fiorello LaGuardia. Remember last time he spoke to us about Robert Moses, extremely interesting topic, and this one's going to be interesting as well. Obviously, Fiorello LaGuardia is a name we all recognize, but we probably don't know very much about him. And just to let you know, Mark is really coming to us from Europe today. As I mentioned before, we really appreciate that he's stepped in to help us out because our other speaker got sick. So again, thanks, Mark. And Mark, the floor is yours and you can share your screen.
Thank you very much, Stu. First off, do you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. All right. That was a great introduction. I really appreciate it. Now, do you see the slideshow?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay. All right. Let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about Fiorello LaGuardia. As you can see, he was short in stature, but he was very tall in what he did. He was the 99th mayor of New York City. And as I say in the title, he was the scourge of the old order and inventor of the new, I almost put order, but I realized he invented a new kind of city. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. He was also the 12th mayor of the greater New York City. That was a New York City that merged in 1898, when Manhattan and the Bronx merged with the outer boroughs to become the New York that we have today. If we look back at that period, a little time machine of the early 30s was a great building boom. The Empire State Building, many other skyscrapers were built, and yet there was still the L train, the elevated train tracks over some of the avenues in Manhattan and other parts, other boroughs. And this is Herald Square with Macy's on the left here. LaGuardia succeeded in putting a number of these underground during his mayoralty. We also had the great New York Yankees baseball team with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, which it was unsurpassed at the time, and I suspect ever since. This is 1934, the year that LaGuardia took office. As you see from this New York Times headline, he was threatened with strikes by the taxi drivers, the hotel unions, the bus drivers, etc. So they saw a new mayor that they would challenge, and he took them on very successfully. He was also challenged by nature. New York had its largest blizzard in 50 years that year, soon after he came into office. As you can see, they still had horse-drawn carriages, and they were lucky because otherwise they couldn't have gotten much of the snow out, even though they had a lot of new automobiles in the police, fire, and sanitation departments. New York was also still one of the largest ports in the world, the largest in the US. You notice piers on both the Hudson River and the East River. All of those were very active with freight coming and going worldwide. And it had still old trolley cars. So this was a kind of a mix of things. As you will see, LaGuardia had to inherit a lot of interesting challenges. What were his antecedents and why was his name Fiorello? There are two important words on this page, rebel and rabbi. His father was Achille LaGuardia, born in Foggia, down in the boot of Italy. And he was truly a rebel. He ran away from home when he was 13 years old. He did not tolerate well the strictures of the society he was born into. His father was a mid-level bureaucrat in the local government, but he was a musician. And he became a very successful band leader after he left home. He played in a number of orchestras, traveling the world in Europe, Indonesia, the United States, and he learned German and English in these travels. He married his wife Irene in 1880 and immigrated to New York City. He'd already been there a number of times in his musical career. LaGuardia was also the great-grandson of a very well-known scholar and rabbi. His mother was Irene Luzzatto Cohen. Her grandfather was Samuel David Luzzatto, a very famous rabbi who was the first to translate the Talmud from Hebrew to Italian. He was widely published as a poet, a biblical and linguistic scholar in multiple languages. He was a leading rabbi and intellectual of the 19th century. Fiorello was born in 1882 in Greenwich Village, 17 years after his great-grandfather died, and named after his grandmother, Fiorina. So that's where the name comes from. And as Rabbi Luzzatto might point out, under the matrilineal principle of Jewish law, LaGuardia would be considered Jewish, although he himself considered himself an Episcopalian. He was not a New Yorker as a child. This comes as a surprise to some people. He was really a boy of the Wild West. He spent his formative years first in the Dakota Territory, and soon after his family was transferred to Prescott, Arizona. And this was because his father took a job as a military band leader in order to support his family. He couldn't live the way he'd been living anymore when he had 2 children. So LaGuardia always considered Prescott, Arizona to be his home. One of the things he saw there as a child that really bothered him was exploitation of Mexican, Native American, and Chinese laborers by contractors and government agents. This was a great building boom of the West when the railroads were expanding and new cities were being built. He frequently got into physical and verbal fights, defending the underdogs as well as himself. He was called various names, including Shorty and some ethnic slurs. He also learned to be a musician. His father taught him trumpet, cornet, banjo, and he learned horsemanship from the soldiers. He even considered becoming a jockey when he was a teenager because of his short stature. But one thing he did that really made an impact on him was he read weekly Pulitzer's New York World. And this was a muckraking paper that exposed many Tammany Hall scandals. And he said as an adult that had prepared him to take on Tammany Hall when he went into politics. So even as a child, he was preparing to fight these real windmills in New York, even though he was out west. Tragedy then occurred in the Spanish-American War. He tried to enlist because his father was being sent to Cuba as a band leader. He was only age 15. He was too short. He was too young, but he was also very persuasive, and he convinced the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper to make him their war correspondent. Unfortunately, en route to Cuba in Tampa, Florida, where they were staying at a fort, his father, along with thousands of other soldiers, were sickened by what they called embalmed beef. It's an early version of Spam, really, but it was full of toxic chemicals, and many of these guys died. His father got severely ill from it. He also came down with malaria. So Fiorello learned from that to have a lifelong hatred of war profiteers, chiselers, cheats, and tin horns, as he called them. And he would act on that later during his political career. Because of his father's illness, they went back to Europe. His father went to Trieste, where the mother's family lived, to recuperate, but he died after 4 years. During this time, LaGuardia became fully fluent in Italian. He had not been allowed to speak that at home as a child because his father wanted him to be truly American. But he was a very gifted linguist. He also learned German, Croatian, and French in this region, which is very polyglot. A friend of his father's got him a job as a clerk at the US consulate in Budapest when he was 19. He convinced the consul to make him the consular agent in Fiume, which is now Rijeka, Croatia, when he was 21. So he was the sole guy there and completely in charge. And what he noticed was that immigrants would leave from the port there. And then some of them would be returning because they've been rejected by the health authorities in New York. They had contagious diseases and they were sent back. So there was a medical inspection when they arrived in New York. So LaGuardia took common sense and said, why don't we do those medical inspections before they leave instead of sending them back broken and literally financially broke too. The consul didn't want to do that. The Cunard lines didn't want to do that because they were paid to bring these people back, but he went ahead and did it anyway. He just ignored them. He made a lot of enemies because of this, and he survived a few more years in that job, but eventually he decides that he would not be a diplomat. It just wasn't the right career for him. But he would fly high again. As you'll notice in this picture, this is LaGuardia flying a Parasol airplane about 10 years after the Wright brothers. He was always interested in new innovations. He learned to fly as a young man, and that helped him later, as we will see. He went back to the US. He realized, I've got to get a serious career going. He took a job as an interpreter at Ellis Island of Italian, Croatian, and German. These were extremely busy times for Ellis Island. 1.25 million immigrants came in 1907, where he was working there. It was the busiest year ever. At the same time, he was going to NYU Night Law School. So he took the ferry over to Ellis Island in the morning, came back in the evening, went to law school. In 1910, he passed the bar exam and he opened a ghetto law practice. And basically, his practice was as labor lawyer and as advocate for these immigrants who came in through Ellis Island, a lot of whom were garment workers. He lived in the Greenwich Village tenement. He had many different kinds of friends, artistic friends, including Enrico Caruso, political friends, and his political activities convinced him to join the Madison Republic Club. As he said, I joined the Republican Party because I could not stomach Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall had been around for 100 years and pretty much dominated New York politics. It was the Democratic political machine. And this cartoon from Thomas Nast shows Tammany, the Tammany tiger, mauling Columbia. Columbia is the female personification of the United States. So they were well known for their corruption. LaGuardia ran soon after he became a lawyer in 1914 for Congress for the first time in his district against Michael Farley, a Tammany congressman, as LaGuardia called him, the sitting congressman. He didn't think he did very much. LaGuardia got the nomination because nobody else wanted it. Pretty much everybody who had ever run against this guy had been defeated, but LaGuardia made a very strong showing. He didn't win, but he was obviously threatening to win. And he did win the next time. He ran again in 1916. He became the first Republican to win this district at Lower East Side. He was also the first what they called Italo-American congressman. He was both a patriot and a gadfly in a Congress that was really, really important. The 65th Congress was the most important since the Civil War. It authorized our first World War. It was evenly divided, literally, 215 to 215, with 5 independents and progressives. LaGuardia voted yes on the direct declaration of the war and on conscription. We hadn't had conscription since the Civil War. When the opposition taunted those in Congress who voted yes to put their lives where their votes are by enlisting, he was one of 5 congressmen who stood up and said he would enlist. He voted a loud no to the Espionage, Sedition, and Trading with the Enemy Acts. He was a vocal opponent of these. He called them draconian. They featured speech and press censorship, 10 to 20 years in jail. As he said, we must curb the hysteria so that we did not destroy, in the war we were now engaged in, the rights we were anxious to preserve. And he was right. This act resulted in over 2,000 arrests and 800 imprisonments, practically none of them for espionage or sedition. Most were political foes of the sitting president, including Representative Victor Berger from Milwaukee, who was also a newspaper publisher. As he said, you got nothing out of the war except the flu and prohibition. We should have to drain the swamp. So somebody else coined that term a long time ago. Eugene Debs was sent to jail. He was a serious presidential candidate who had garnered millions of votes, over 100 labor leaders. So this was a way to quelch dissent, and it really did. He voted no to the Volstead Act, prohibition, which was coming into vogue at this time. He claimed it would penalize the working man and enrich the bootleggers and politicians. He was good to his word. He did enlist. He became a flying congressman and at the same time an Italian orator. As we said, he had learned to fly from a friend of his who was an aircraft designer in Long Island and one of his law clients. He signed up for the new Air Corps. This was the first real air war, and he was a member of that group. Before leaving Congress, he helped to pass the $640 million military appropriation bill, the largest since the Civil War. He also fought and won any new orders for what was called the Liberty motor. The pilots call it the flying coffin because it was defective and would frequently break down, killing them. He was one of the few congressmen to understand this and convinced the rest of Congress to change the path and pick a different kind of design for the engines. When he got to Italy, he met Thomas Nelson Page, also known as Sir Thomas of Shenandoah. He was a courtly Virginian, US ambassador to Italy, a best-selling novelist. And as soon as he met LaGuardia, he kind of realized, here's the guy I need to help do some propaganda with the Italians. The Italians were completely demoralized. Their finances were completely drained. They had very few raw materials remaining. Their food stocks were down, etc. So he gave public speeches and rallies in the Italian language to over 300,000 people throughout Italy, Milan, Genoa, Rome, etc. Big cities. He looked small, but when he started to speak, he became a giant, as one viewer said. This was an enormous success. The king invited him to dinner, awarded him with the highest Italian medal, and he also befriended many key figures in the Italian government and the American Expeditionary Force leadership in Paris. So he was gaining a lot of visibility, and also he was quite successful in his military activities. His roles in this campaign were ever increasing responsibility. When he started, he was captain of the 8th Aviation Instruction Center down in Foggia, where his father had come from. This was just a coincidence. He got a promotion to major and commanding officer of the American Combat Division in northern Italy, very near where his mother was from, in Trieste. And they ran bombing sorties over the Austrian military targets. He was US Army representative to the Joint Army and Navy Aircraft Committee in Italy, which made him responsible in part for aircraft and related materials procurement. He was a public speaker, as we've seen, to the Italian people. And most of all, for his men, he was a BS detector and lifesaver. For example, SIA was an Italian aircraft manufacturer that had a large contract to supply airplanes to the American military. These planes were defective. LaGuardia heard about it, he knew about it. When they sent them to his base, he refused to sign for them. The generals threatened to court-martial him. So he said, why don't you test the planes? And they did, and the very first one they tested fell apart in midair, the pilot was killed, and they completely changed their purchasing strategy as a result. He did something very interesting in the sexually transmitted disease front. He knew that these pilots would be going to Rome, to the red light district. So he wanted to provide prophylactics for them, because a lot of the Italian soldiers were getting venereal diseases. The generals didn't want that, so he sent a bunch of women around with baby buggies through the red light district full of prophylactics, and he put a military disease center just on the edge of the district because he couldn't put it in it. So he did a lot of things that were kind of against the grain. He catered food for his troops because the Italian food was so poor because they had no money. He put malaria nets. The Italians laughed at him, but he didn't get any cases of malaria, and they were full of them. Finally, he was a smuggler of steel and wood. The Italians were way down on their raw materials. They couldn't build enough planes. So he needed a way to find more raw materials. So he went to neutral Spain, which was not supposed to sell to any of the belligerents. And he found somebody who would help him, a gentleman called Mr. Taha, who owned a large freight line, ocean freight line. And his ships had been frequently the victims of U-boat attacks. And one of them went down with his own son. So he was very pro the Allies. And he helped LaGuardia to bring steel and wood back to Italy very successfully. And as LaGuardia's biography says, he had gone off to battle a vaguely known freshman congressman. In Foggia, he became an experienced leader who commanded men, negotiated with foreign governments, served as a popular spokesperson for the American cause, and earned a chest full of medals to boot. He came back to the US just before the election in November of 1918. He was still actually a sitting congressman. He was reelected in a landslide. Even Tammany Hall supported him because he was a true war hero. So after about a year in Congress, the Republicans approach him and say, look, why don't you run for the president of the New York City Board of Aldermen? You're probably a shoo-in, you're so popular right now. And we promise we'll make you our mayoral candidate in another year, 1921. So he said, okay, I'll do it. He won, of course. He resigned from Congress. And rather than sort of going along to get along, he started an investigation of the controller and how he awarded city contracts. It was a very corrupt process. 69 of the controller's associates and contractors were convicted and sent to prison. Though not the controller, Craig himself. LaGuardia got tremendous results within less than 2 years, but he was completely disgusted. The Republicans turned on him because he was too insurgent, because they were also playing this game. So they reneged on their promise to nominate him. He didn't run again as alderman president. Instead, he decided to enter the Republican primary for mayor against the blessed candidate, Henry Curran. LaGuardia lost. He had a huge loss, but Mayor Hyland, who was a sitting mayor and Democrat, did beat Curran, and LaGuardia was kind of happy about that. Interestingly, Hyland, who was a Tammany man, developed a great deal of respect for LaGuardia. As he said, no more efficient, no fairer or conscientious man ever held office in city government. There is no office or gift of the people that is too good for you. That's high praise coming from the opposing party's leader. So he decides, well, let's go back to Congress. So he goes to a new district. This is on the East Harlem, essentially, Upper East Side, 99th to 120th Streets, from the East River to Fifth Avenue. It's a very small district at the time. 250,000 residents, so densely populated, but 1 square mile geographically. It was a very favorable district for him. It had the most Italians of any district, and 26 different ethnic groups, so his linguistic skills could help him out. The other largest group were the Jewish voters. So he had to get some of those votes to win this election. Mayor Hyland even broke with his own party to endorse LaGuardia, and he sent police to guard the ballot boxes, which was a very important issue because Tammany Hall had ways to stuff ballots that they had developed for decades. Then there was this event. Henry Frank who was his opponent, his Democrat opponent, mailed a postcard to every Jewish voter in the district, claiming that he was the only truly Jewish candidate in the race. And the others were Carlin, who was a third-party candidate, socialist, the atheist, and second, the Italian, LaGuardia, the Republican, who was a pronounced anti-Semite and Jew hater. Now, of course, LaGuardia hit the ceiling when he saw this, given that he was half Jewish, but he found that it was a golden opportunity because Frank did not speak Yiddish, and LaGuardia did. So he took out an advertisement in the Yiddish paper and said, very well, I hereby challenge you to publicly and openly debate the issues conducted by you and me entirely in the Yiddish language. Frank, of course, had to decline. LaGuardia went to all those groups and spoke to them in their language on the issues, and he even got the rabbis on his side. So Frank lost the election, although it seemed going in he would probably win because it was the Jewish vote was the largest vote in that district. So what did he do for the next years in Congress? In the 1920s, it was a period of progressive coalition building. As the progressives stated under LaGuardia's tutelage, it is unwholesome in any republic the 5% of the nation's citizens own 80% of the nation's wealth. Only a well-fed, well-housed, well-schooled people can enjoy the blessings of liberty. We see that again in our own day, that same discussion coming up. And part of this was because of the huge wave of immigration since 1880. 25 million immigrants, 2/3 of these had gone through Ellis Island. Many stayed in New York. By 1920, New York had added 400,000 additional Italians and over 1 million additional Jews. These were mostly poor. The Jews came from Eastern Europe. Both groups dwelled in tenements. At times, these were up to half of New York City housing. So the whole progressive idea was in the air. LaGuardia realized he needed allies to realize success. So he joined with Senator George Norris in the Senate, who was a progressive from Nebraska. So this was a coalition of farm, labor, and urban progressives, which was a new kind of coalition pointing to the New Deal in the 1930s. At this time, LaGuardia and Norris were basically fighting against the powers that be, Secretary of the Treasury Mellon, Presidents Coolidge and Hoover, over what they perceived as regressive taxes. The old guard in his own party once again rejected him. They wouldn't give him the nomination in 1924, so he ran as a socialist and he won in a landslide victory. He went back to the Republicans in 1926. As he said, it's still better to joke about being a lone Republican from New York City than a lone socialist in Congress. And in 1929, he finally did get the Republican nomination for New York City mayor, but he didn't resign as a congressman. The sitting mayor was Bo James, Jimmy Walker. He was a very dapper, popular, but corrupt Tammany Hall mayor. LaGuardia called him out on his political and criminal excesses. He did deep revelations of the kinds of corruption in Walker's government, but he still lost. The economy was still going strong, etc. And Walker was just a very popular guy. So he goes back to Congress for the additional 3 to 4 years that he spent there. This resulted in the Norris-LaGuardia Act. It was a landmark piece of labor legislation and a lot of other new order type of forays that didn't get put into legislation yet, but were preparing the New Deal. Roosevelt called him our Churchill because of his constant challenging of Europeans' dictators. These are 3 statements, the first in Yiddish to the rabbis, condemning all 3, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin, and then, of course, challenging when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1930s. And he backed this with action when he became mayor. He found that the Tunnel and Bridge Authority had a 500-ton steel order from Germany. He canceled it and gave it to American providers. And also Mussolini, he saw him as a bully. So more importantly, during his wilderness years in Congress, he fought for a series of innovative reform legislation, not only on social issues, but on consumer, financial, and national infrastructure issues. He was deeply involved with the Tennessee Valley Authority, with the Boulder, what is now the Hoover Dam, the National Labor Relations Act, the Federal Housing Act, old age pensions, which later became Social Security, etc., on and on, bank deposit insurance. Now, not all of these became law, but they were beginning to be sort of popular elements of possible legislation when the Roosevelt administration came in. Of course, he also pounded away to make Columbus Day a holiday. He did get it, but as we know, yesterday's hero may be today's statue to topple. And finally, the Norris-LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act was designed by him and Senator Norris to help labor to be able to have strikes, because the companies would get injunctions against labor before they even started to strike on the idea that these would become violent. So essentially this said, no, you can strike as long as you're not violent. And it was a precursor to the Wagner Act. Okay, FDR, who LaGuardia pretty much campaigned for, even though he was a Republican, won the big election of 1932. It was a Democratic sweep. LaGuardia gets kicked out himself. The Democrats put a younger Italian guy who was successful in defeating him. But Cactus Jack Garner was the vice president-elect who was also Speaker of the House. He named LaGuardia and Norris, among others, to work very fast during the lame duck session, which lasted until March at that period. The president wasn't signed in until March, sworn in. So he had passed a number of successful bills, including the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Glass-Steagall Act extension, the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, Federal Home Loan Bank Act, and had constructed a list of bills introduced into the Congress of 6 closely spaced pages. So there were a lot of things that were going on here in preparation for FDR to take office in March. President Hoover sought to plug the Depression deficit with a sales tax on manufactured goods. LaGuardia vocally opposed that, and this time he prevailed. This tax did not pass. So the tide had really turned. And lastly, the lame duck Congress finally passes the 21st Amendment repealing prohibition. That, of course, raised his stature further. He went home, named America's Congressman. People throughout the country had gotten to know him as he went around the country investigating for these various bills. So finally, he does become mayor. His patron saint, and the reason he became mayor, is Samuel Seabury. He's that gentleman there with the halo. And there was a fusion party. During the mayoral election of '29, LaGuardia had challenged Roosevelt, who was governor, to investigate Mayor Walker and his corruption. Roosevelt had kind of avoided doing that because he wanted New York City's power brokers to support him for president. But within 2 years, his hand was forced because it became very public in the press that there were payoffs to judges by the Walker group. And he had to name somebody to do an independent investigation. He picked Samuel Seabury, a very august white shoe lawyer who had impeccable credentials. His family came over on the Mayflower. He extended that investigation, not just into Walker, but throughout Tammany, and brought down enormous numbers of high echelon people, judges, mobsters, the New York County Sheriff, Mayor Walker himself, who fled the country rather than face conviction, who went to Europe, and his broker who went to Mexico. So this was really a sea change for New York. And LaGuardia was widely given credit for this. A fusion party was founded with different parties coming together, Democrats, Republicans, Labor, to pick a candidate who would be a reformer. Seabury was the obvious choice himself, but he refused. And he insisted that LaGuardia be named the candidate, even though the rest of the fusion group, for the most part, wanted Robert Moses, but he refused to go along with that. So without him, probably LaGuardia would not have become mayor. But as I say here, in little or in much, do not act corruptly. I think that was his great strength. He was not corrupt. His very first official act was to cut his own salary in half to lead by example, because he knew that he would be cutting employees in a time of depression. So the first 100 days, some people called him a midget Mussolini, others a Lightspeed CEO. As he said, in this administration, I am the majority. And he had to fight several battles, one with the federal government. They were developing these new means of bringing federal relief to the economy, such as the Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration. So after the election, he basically went down to Washington and spent days cultivating the people that ran these organizations, Harry Hopkins and Ickes. So these were all New Yorkers, conveniently, because FDR had brought them down there, which helped him a lot. Because of his tireless work, by the time he took office, New York had captured 20% of all job slots allocated by the CWA. But he also had to fight the city and state government. Tammany had left the city facing ruin. They had $330 million in debt on a $550 million budget, short-term, high-interest debt. So he proposed an emergency economy bill, which essentially would have made him a complete autocrat for 2 years, able to fire people, rearrange departments, etc. Obviously, that didn't take immediate effect because it was resisted by various people. So he compromised. He would do this for 9 months, not 2 years. This was acceptable both to the New York City Board of Aldermen and the New York State Assembly. But Governor Lehman threatened to veto it. He said it would give him dictatorial power. So he went to meet Lehman. They removed parts of the bill that were offensive to Lehman, and he supported it after Roosevelt also basically told him, you should do this. Then Tammany Hall screamed that this would cause big layoffs. They were right. But as a result of that, it was rejected in the legislature. But finally, in April, it was accepted and he was off and running. And he really did hit the ground running. He never stopped. He was always reinventing. Historians agree that he had the most talented group of commissioners and department heads ever of any New York City mayor. They were professionals. Obviously, Robert Moses. Langdon Post was a pioneer in housing innovation and removing tenements and replacing them with public housing. Louis Valentine was the police commissioner. He'd been a sort of an investigator of internal corruption. So he'd been sort of sent off to the Siberia of New York City police until LaGuardia came along and made him commissioner. And similar, William Carey had headed the excavation of the Panama Canal and was a very successful home builder in the private sector. And then you had people like Moses saying, well, they tell me that I don't let the engineers sleep. They're working around the clock. So what did he do? He brought in cots to put in the offices so they could sleep at the office, but not for very long. And why was this so important? Why were they working so hard and so fast? Because they didn't know if the federal government dollars would continue to flow, if Roosevelt would get reelected, if the PWA or the CWA would not be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So they really moved at lightning speed. Look at all the things they did in his first term: the Triborough Bridge, East River Drive, the first public houses, both that and the Williamsburg houses, which were publicly funded, the Lincoln Tunnel in Queens Midtown, lots of public schools, 2 colleges, various subway extensions. There was a tremendous amount of work done. They also completed a revision of the New York City Charter, which had been promised for decades and deeply needed for civil service reform. And he had victory in the Artichoke War. The artichoke market was controlled by the mob, as were many of the produce and vegetable markets. So he and Valentine went up to Hunts Point in the Bronx, seized all the artichokes, told the mob they were no longer going to be running this business. He'd already contracted with other people to do this and with the artichoke growers in California, all of whom were very happy because the mob had putting the screws to them while charging 40% overpriced in New York. And this was a very successful and popular move and kind of a shot over the bow to the mob that he was going to come for them. All of this led to a really fortuitous bromance between FDR and LaGuardia, which led to the new city that he created. As Roosevelt said, our mayor is probably the most appealing person I know. He comes to Washington and tells me a great story. The tears run down my cheeks and tears run down his cheeks. And for the first thing I know, he wangled another $50 million. It didn't start like this. They had a very rocky start. LaGuardia named Moses as his parks head, and Roosevelt didn't want this. Roosevelt really disliked Moses. They hated each other. And in addition, there was a law that said you couldn't hold a state and a city job. So LaGuardia had to basically do a stare down with FDR, and by schmoozing with various people within the FDR brain trust, he convinced FDR that Moses needed to be there for everybody's sake. After this, things get a lot smoother. He was making regular visits to Washington, D.C. The city even rented an apartment for him down there. He spent a lot of time lobbying the key cabinet heads and various people in Congress, et cetera, the Treasury Secretary. And he created a very strong bond with lots of these people. He was also president of the US Conference of Mayors and de facto spokesman for the cities for a decade from 1935. So FDR invited him to be on his allotment advisory committee, which is an extremely important committee because it looked at projects to spend New Deal dollars before they were actually passed into Congress. So he and FDR were the only ones that attended all of these meetings. He considered it so important to be there. And under his influence, 25% of all federal highway funds went to cities. So he was a big booster for the major cities. His second term, he continued in these types of accomplishments. He also had visions of higher office. I love this job, but I can think of one better. I mean, he was obviously thinking maybe I could be president someday. The Republicans in 37 again tried to block his renomination because the year before he'd gone out and campaigned for FDR and the New Deal. He literally went from one city to another because he was so popular in the cities to speak on behalf of FDR. He was a surrogate for him. But the Republicans had no other choice. They knew it would split their party terribly if they did this. And to their benefit, the Democrats split instead. Al Smith had this falling out with FDR, and they put up a candidate who was kind of a nice guy with nothing compared to LaGuardia. And as LaGuardia's biographer says, within 4 years, LaGuardia's innovative extensions and of municipal responsibility have become the new normal, and no serious candidate, least of all a moderate like Manny, dared attack it. And even Roosevelt did not endorse this candidate, de facto endorsing LaGuardia. He won by a landslide. He became known as Lincoln of the Ghetto. There was some talk of him running for president if FDR declined to go for a third term. Many people thought he would, but given that the war in Europe had started, he did obviously run again. But you'll notice in this victory page on the New York Times, there's this other guy there, Tom Dewey, who had a great partnership with LaGuardia, even though he didn't like him, in continuing the war against the mob. And this is the cleaning up the new city, getting rid of the mob bosses, the honest graft politicians, the chiselers and tin horns, and new sheriffs in town, and that's Sheriff LaGuardia. So as he would do frequently, he'd have these publicity stunts where he'd smash up these slot machines that were illegally placed throughout the city by the mob. The police commissioner would muss them up. He was not afraid to tackle them physically or to be intimidated by them. And Thomas Dewey would lock them up, quite literally. He got 72 of 73 convictions, which is a rare record. And he went after everybody, Italian mobsters like Lucky Luciano, Jewish mobsters like Waxy Gordon, Irish Tammany kingpins like Jimmy Hines, and not to mention the German-American Nazis. Fritz Kuhn got 5 years. So there was a real cleanup of the mob, and many of these guys left New York to go to other cities or ended up in jail. Another must-have for the New York's new city, airports and global travel. LaGuardia's history was full of aircraft. He was a pilot himself. He understood the importance that this kind of travel would have in the future, and he wanted New York to have the biggest and best airports. So the first thing he did was acquire acreage around Curtis Field, filling in a bunch of marshes. It was a huge project, 5,000 men working 3 shifts around the day, 6 days a week, 2 years. It must be ready for the 1939 World's Fair. And this was called Fiorello's Folly. But when it was built, it was the most modern airport in the world. It had the longest runway and the brightest tower beacon. And it was no longer his folly. 350,000 people attended the opening in 1939. And he had this kind of novel idea that, gee, why don't we try to sell things to the customers that are at the airport while they're waiting for their planes? And we can rent space to retailers. He hired this guy named David Rockefeller to run the program. It was a huge success. At first, people laughed at it, thinking this would never happen. But it was soon generating $100,000 in annual rent, which was a huge success at the time. Later, he bought land further out in Queens called Idlewild, which became Idlewild Airport, and later JFK. In his third term, he ran again in 1941. As Tom Dewey said, I shouldn't do this for the SOB, but we're going to give him the endorsement again. The Republicans were always wishing they could get rid of him, but they couldn't because he was too popular. So they reluctantly renominate him. The Democrats want a stronger candidate this time, William O'Dwyer. He was a Brooklyn DA and a very successful one. LaGuardia was also getting a little bit frazzled by this time. His nerves were on edge. He was becoming much coarser in his language, throwing temper tantrums. And the press, who had once loved him, and now were being a little bit more curmudgeonly towards him. And it was a very dirty election. He did win. It was a close victory. But he took on a lot of roles, and it really was too many things to do at once. He still had national aspirations. FDR named him chair of the US-Canadian Joint Defense Board. This is the beginning of World War II. Head of the Office of Civil Defense. That was a national office, which was a springboard to higher office. He was spending 3 days a week in Washington at cabinet meetings, then going back to New York as mayor. He started having a lot of stress and health problems, but he did his duties. He organized civil defense and spy networks in New York and nationally. He flew to California to organize air defense against feared Japanese attacks after Pearl Harbor on the West Coast. And these were not just imaginary. The Germans did succeed in mining New York Harbor very briefly. The mines were discovered and removed within 2 days. He was getting very irascible with the press. So finally, a full-time professional just took over the Office of Civil Defense. As he said, sin does not pay. I am about to give up my dual life. So he went back to being mayor, which is what he was best at. And just one more mayoral model of crisis management. And in what's happened in our country in the past 18 months, I think this is pretty illustrative of how a good mayor can operate. The Black population had grown tremendously during his third term, 40% to 500,000 people. Most lived in Harlem. LaGuardia had done more for them. As for the other minority groups, public housing in Harlem, Central Harlem Health Center and local clinics, a new women's wing at the Harlem Hospital, schools, swimming pools. You remember seeing some of those in the Moses presentation. The city hospitals were ordered to hire Black doctors and nurses, as were the police, fire, transit, and relief agencies. And he also pressed FDR to enact the Fair Employment Practices Act. But there was another brilliant politician who showed up this time, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. He was also a great orator and showman, much as LaGuardia himself, and he wanted more for his communities. He called it the double V: victory in the war overseas and victory against racism in the States. So he was a gadfly to LaGuardia. And at this time, in 1943, race riots began to explode across the US that summer. The worst was in Detroit. 34 people died, 700 were injured. There was a lot of arson and looting. So LaGuardia, seeing that this was happening, took preemptive actions. He first used his regular radio address to try to calm passions. Remember, he spoke regularly, weekly, to the citizens of New York. Second, he put together a committee with Black leaders to improve race relations. And third, Commissioner Valentine promoted more Black officers and limited the use of guns by police to self-defense only. In spite of this, on the 1st of August, there was a brief fracas between a white police officer, a Black woman, and a Black Army private. It was rumored that the officer had killed the private. He had not. But this created a riot in Harlem. LaGuardia took immediate action. He set up a command post in Harlem at the 28th precinct with Commissioner Valentine and the fire commissioner. He ordered all police to remain on duty after their shifts. He called in an army detachment, and he deputized 1,500 Black volunteers to fan out and keep the peace within Harlem. Now, obviously, he had prepared this in advance. This didn't just happen overnight. He himself traveled throughout Harlem with Black leaders on a flatbed truck, telling people to go home, that the soldier had not been killed. And he sealed off Harlem except for food and medicine deliveries. And he implemented a curfew. And he basically told people who were caught looting, vandalizing, or committing physical harm that they would be dealt with severely. This ended within 36 hours. There were 6 deaths, but certainly nothing like what happened in Detroit. And after this, he did not rest. He used the riot, along with his judicial power, to begin trying to root out discrimination, particularly against MetLife, which ran many of these housing projects. They had financed them and had an active discrimination policy against African Americans. So he fought against that. He couldn't obviously change everything in the next couple of years, but even Adam Clayton Powell praised his wise and effective leadership and handling of the riot. So what's his legacy? He's considered America's most successful mayor ever and the model for good government. He entered office in 1934 with five main goals, all of which were achieved: restore New York City's financial health, break away from the bankers' control, expand federally funded work relief programs for the unemployed, end corruption in government and racketeering in key sectors of the economy, replace patronage with a prestigious merit-based civil service, and modernize the infrastructure, especially transportation and parks. And how did he do this? One, his own personality and temperament. Two, he revised the New York City Charter. It was a 2,000-page antiquated document, did not consider many of the things needed for modern life. He created a new city legal and administrative structure. So when we're talking about creating a new city, he literally created the administrative structure to do that, so that the customer, the taxpayer, would see this as a professional management, enabling them to help to build their own lives. He hired the best people he could and worked with them in a hands-on way. And he was, very importantly, the first to link cities directly to the federal government with new financing models, enabling these large projects. This had never been tried before, and it was a real innovation developed by him and by FDR and FDR's brain trust and cabinet. He also modernized the subway. He bought out the failing private operators, added miles of new track. He made New York City a world destination with the two great airports. He created the first public-private health insurance for middle and lower income, HIP, which is still there today. And lastly, he was incorruptible. As Lucky Luciano said, "I just couldn't understand that guy. We offered to make him rich and he wouldn't even listen." He finally pioneered the use of radio. He was very interested in new media. Even before FDR, he was doing a report on Congress when he was a congressman in the 1920s on the radio. He had the weekly talks to the people during his mayoralty. He had a program called Fiorello LaGuardia Calling Rome in Italian during World War II. It was like a propaganda program to inform the Italians of what was happening in the war effort. And of course, Mayor LaGuardia reads the comics, which everybody in that generation remembers, because the comics were not available. The transportation guys had gone on strike, so he read the comics over the radio. Just one final comment from Robert Moses, his inimitable way of writing. "The mayor seemed to have a vision, not of the Statue of Liberty, calm, static, dignified, lifting her lamp beside the golden door, but of the little fleur-de-lis himself, his torch a flaming sword, riding the whirlwind of reform, directing the storm of progress straight into the millennium." And that's pretty much the way he was, although he was much more prosaic. He said, "What are you most proud of? I raised the standard of municipal government everywhere in this country by raising it in New York and so proving it could be raised." A mayor who cannot look 50 or 75 years ahead is not worthy of being in City Hall. That said, I would be happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Mark. That was a fascinating talk. Like I said in the beginning, I don't think we knew anything about him. Guys, if you have questions, please raise your hand on the Zoom screen. I'll start with one, Mark.
Sure.
You didn't mention anything much about his family or his social life. Can you
Yes.
tell us something about that?
Yes. When he came back from the war, he married a young Italian-American woman. They lived in a tenement down in Greenwich Village. They had a child. Unfortunately, the child got tuberculosis, and then the mother got tuberculosis trying to nurse the child. And within 11 months, they were both dead. So he was a widower. And then later, when he was in Congress in his 40s, he and his chief administrative staffer, a woman who was about a foot taller than him, fell in love and got married. And he adopted two children. who had very successful careers later on. One of them, I believe, is still alive. He's about 90 years old. So, you know, it's a very interesting family life, not very, I mean, it was very tragic in a sense. And one of the reasons he was so driven to replace these tenements was his own experience with disease, you know, of his wife and child.
Good, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions, guys? Gee, they usually ask lots of questions.
Nobody was around to listen to the comics.
I don't know. Well, not seeing any other questions. Again, Mark, thanks again, and especially for helping us out. I know there are a number of other topics you could talk to us about, and we'll be calling you again.
Well, thank you.
So again, we really appreciate that. Joe, back to you.
Hi, thank you, Stu. Mark, thank you. I have a vague recollection of Mayor LaGuardia, probably just at the age, you know, I was 3 or 4, and
Yeah.
Just at that age where you start to realize things. And I remember he came up, I don't know, maybe in the Bronx, White Plains Road and Burke Avenue, and they had a bandstand or a grandstand dais set up for it, and he gave a speech, and all I can remember is sitting on my father's shoulder, and mayor, that's the mayor, that's the mayor.
Sometimes he would take the baton and lead the orchestra himself.
Yeah, well, this was just, there was no order. This was just a block party. I don't know if it was a party or anything, but I just remember this stand that they had set up, and he was speaking, and I mean, it was a crowded, I don't know, it was the end of the war or whatever it was, but I was probably about, like I say, 3 or 4 years old at the time.
Well, the truth is, when I started looking at Robert Moses's life, it's when I really discovered how interesting LaGuardia is. He was not just a mayor, but a long-term congressman and a military hero, etc. He had a deep experience of life.
Again, thank you so much for your presentation, and guys,
Thank you.
to see you next week, and be careful, stay well, and have a good week.
Thank you very much.
Okay.